Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or preferably both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. The slaves shuffled to a halt around Willow and Edmund. Edmund tapped her shoulder, and she smoothly let him down. His stiff legs wobbled slightly as he stood there. The elves stalked over to him and made the slaves all back away until just he and Willow remained where they were. A cold wind swept over the moor and whipped around them, causing Edmund to shiver. "Back away, stickhead," growled Gally. "This doesn't concern you." Willow, who had stepped in front of Edmund, answered defiantly. "This has everything to do with me, Fjorkir, and you know it." Gally snarled and struck at Willow with his fist, which she neatly pushed to the side before the blow could land. The two of them stood there, glaring at each other. "Lorne," called Gally. Immediately, Willow's face contorted into a painful grimace, and she dropped to her knees, panting. Gally leaned in and growled in her face. "Don't you ever call me that again. Do you understand me, slave?" Looking up to him shakily, Willow smirked. Gritting her teeth, she replied, "Fjork ear." This time she didn't move to defend herself from the blow to her jaw. She rolled limply to the side and lay in the stony turf amongst the gawking slaves. Gally turned to Edmund, rage smoldering beneath his eyes. "Now then," he said calmly, "the reason we're all finally setting off homeward." He paused. The slaves all looked at Edmund. "You are the reason why finally, after months of trudging all over the Northlands, we get to set our sights homeward." He punched Edmund in the stomach, hard. The wind rushed from his lungs. Falling to his knees, Edmund struggled to breathe. Gally nodded at him. "It's a pretty ring you've got there. Mind if I take a look at it?" He grabbed Edmund's left hand and wrenched the silver ring from his finger. Placing it on his own, the elf continued to speak. "So I suppose we all should thank you, Stormhand." He punctuated the last word with a punch to Edmund's jaw that sent him tumbling onto his side in the dirt, gasping for air. A patterned cut left by the silver ring now decorated his skin. "So thank you, Edmund. Thank you for giving yourself up so nicely that we didn't have to chase you all over the rutting Northlands." He kicked him in the chest with a heavy boot. Edmund felt ribs crack. Again, the elf kicked him. Again, his ribs cracked beneath the weight of the elf's blow. Edmund lay on his side, desperately trying to pull air into his chest, but each attempt sent a searing pain through his side. Gally kicked him again in the side. Again, and again. Edmund no longer tried to breathe. He lay on his side, unable to move, unable to take a breath. Each kick pushed bloody bile up into his throat and mouth. Finally, the blows stopped coming. Gally shouted, out of breath, "Rel, make it so he can breathe and walk. Leave the rest." Edmund saw a pair of boots walk toward him. A low hum began, and he felt a rush of healing magic enter his body. With a gasp, he sucked in a breath of air. Despite the excruciating pain in his sides, the air tasted sweet. The healing stopped, and the boots walked away. Edmund's ribs still ached, almost more than he could bear. He could breathe, but every breath was agony. Hands grabbed his arms from behind and pulled him to his feet. He cried out as his ribcage twisted. The strong hands held him in place as he regained his footing. He turned to see Willow. "That wasn't too bad now, was it, River?" Blood and dirt smeared her lip and cheek. "That Fjorkir hits like a fawn, doesn't he?" The smirk was gone from her mouth. Edmund struggled to smile at her. "Just like a fawn," he answered weakly. While Edmund was being beaten, the gathered slaves had stood there and watched. Watched and done nothing. What could they have done? This had happened several times before with other slaves. The elves were ruthless when it came to punishment. Balsa stood behind the other captive wood elves, peering quietly over her brother's shoulder. She had been taken by surprise by the slavers on the road, as she and her brother, Brayhart, were traveling toward North Harbor. She had just passed the master trials as a spear wielder, and was headed to receive her emblem of mastery. Her brother had received his some 40-odd years before, as a sword master. As per tradition, new masters and their companions were to make the journey without weapons of any kind. The slavers had outnumbered them, but she had still fought. This man, Edmund Stormhand, as she had heard, as powerful as he was, had given himself up without a struggle. And then, when the slavers were at their strongest, he had subdued them as easily as a falcon kills a young rabbit. If that Yordic girl hadn't stopped him, he would have killed all 13 mountain elves, and the slaves, including her and her brother, would have gone free. She was fairly certain that when the master of the collar died, the collar would fall off or shut off or something of the like. That stupid girl had ruined her first real chance of escape, but Balsa didn't plan on giving up so soon. She hadn't passed the master trials by giving up on her first try. The mage was key. He was the only one she had ever seen subdue an elf so easily. She found it strangely intriguing. He must have used some trick or manipulated the elf's connection somehow. Either way, all she had to do was to get one of the slavers killed, one of the slavers who had control over a collar. If it released the slave, then she would kill the one who had put the collar on the mage, and he would be free to use his trick again. She would also have to prevent the foolish Northlander girl from stopping him again. The slavers led them onward. The lumbars loomed up ahead of them as the hilly moorland stretched out for miles in every direction. Cold winds blew steadily across the uplands, hitting the party from each side, making it impossible to escape the chill. It was the evening of their third night on the moor when the Gavader began to howl. Far in the distance, the eerie sound echoed through the heavy wind. The slaves slept huddled together around small fire pits. The elves slept apart from them, with posted sentries. The pack horses stood nervously in a cluster near the elves. Edmund sat next to Willow, cradling his ribs. The ache, coupled with the guild spell, made it impossible for him to sleep. Willow had spotted some willow saplings growing near a stream and had grabbed a couple of the branches. Giving them to Edmund, she had instructed him to chew on the leaves and the soft bark. It helped with the pain a bit, but not as much as Edmund would have liked. The slavers had shoved a heavy sack into his hands from one of the pack horses. It felt like it was filled with grain. The sack had no straps on it and was awkward to handle. He had to hold it in front of him as he walked, which made his ribs burn worse with each step. The wind hit him in the face, chilling him to the bone. Walking was the only thing that had warmed him. Now, as he sat panting next to Willow, he tried to think of a way to escape. He had talked to Willow about it, but she had advised against it. "We can't risk an escape attempt when we are powerless to fight back," she had said. "The collars make us too vulnerable. We must wait until we can get them off." She was right, of course. Besides, even if they were to escape now, the Gavader would pick them off before the first night was through. Another long, piercing howl came from the darkness to the east. The first had come from the west. Another sounded soon after from the north. This was how it started, the constant hounding. The pack would signal back and forth all around. Each howl would be closer than the previous. When they had drawn near enough to see their prey, they would begin the horrible laugh. Edmund shivered. He could have easily gone the rest of his life without hearing that laughter again, and been happy about it. The Gavader had perfected the hunting of man. There was no long chase, no fight to the death. They simply unnerved their prey with the steady, unnatural, laughing chuckle that sounded almost human, yet terrible and ghastly at the same time. Eventually, someone would go mad and bolt, desperately trying to escape the constant torment and sleepless nights, and they would run straight into the open mouths of the patient Gavader. Edmund wondered who, in this group, would be the first to break. It wouldn't be him. He knew all too well what waited in the darkness. An idea came to him. He searched the slaves around him until he found the person he sought. Groaning as he stood up, Edmund slowly made his way over to him, carefully picking his way through the huddled sleepers. A howl drifted to his ears. South. He sat down gingerly next to him. "I need to know about these collars." There was silence for a moment as he waited for the response. "What do you want to know?" came the sullen answer. "How far do they work?" "It's not a question of distance. It's a visual link. If they can see you, they can use the collar. If you are, say, standing behind a wall, even if you are right next to them, and they don't see you, you're safe." Edmund nodded. That made sense. When he had been running from the weirder, he had not used the collar against him. He must not have been able to. A howl drifted through the camp. West. However, if they're near you, then they can sense the caller's presence, said Merritt. That's how they found you in the forest. Edmund grimaced. He had been afraid of that. But as long as he made his escape at night, they wouldn't be able to see him. The Gavadar would keep them from getting close enough. The hilly moor would give them enough cover to use fire to keep the Gavadar at bay without being seen by the mountain elves. Edmund smiled. The plan was coming together in his mind. You're planning to escape, aren't you? Asked Merritt. Another howl. North. Edmund shrugged his shoulders. I don't know what you're talking about. Did it hurt you when my mama hit you on the head? Asked a voice at Edmund's side. Surprised, Edmund looked down to find a small boy sitting next to him, cross-legged. He wore heavy Northlander clothes, characteristic of villages in the Atlas foothills. Judging by the patterns woven into the leather, probably a village near or in the Northwood. If you try to escape again, my mama will just stop you again. She says that no one is supposed to try and escape. You'd better do what she says. She gets scary when she's angry. Edmund smiled at him. Well, I wouldn't want to see her angry. The little boy shook his head knowingly. Another howl. East. Very well, said Edmund. I won't try to escape. He looked up and saw that Merritt was gazing suspiciously at him. Edmund gave him a quick glare before standing up and returning to his spot near Willow. It's still a bad idea, said Willow after he had filled her in on his plan, but it may work considering the caller's visual limitation. There are plenty of places that we can hide from the elves' sight. The Gavadar should keep them from creeping up on us in the night. Another howl sounded. South. They were getting closer. Edmund gestured with his chin southward toward the echoing howl. The longer we wait, the closer the Gavadar will get. We can't wait until they're right on top of us, or we won't stand a chance. He took a deep breath, wincing at the ensuing pain in his ribs. It has to be tonight. How will these elves react to the Gavadar? Asked Willow. If they try to capture us again, they might use their magic to try and drive the Gavadar away. They wouldn't risk it, said Edmund, shaking his head. We're just 2 slaves. The Gavadar hunt in small groups, usually no more than 4 or 5. If the elves use their magic to try and drive them off, it will only draw the rest of the pack, which could be as much as 50. I don't think we're important enough to risk that. It would be better for them to let 2 slaves escape than to jeopardize losing the rest. Another howl. North. Then let us be off as soon as it is dark. It will be nice to be rid of all these men's looks of interest. Even I have a limit, said Willow. Let us hope we aren't worth chasing. The 2 of them sat in silence as they waited. The howls grew closer and the sun sank lower. When finally darkness came, Edmund and Willow crept stealthily to the edge of the fire pit. They took with them 2 unlit torches they had stolen from one of the packs. The elf guards wouldn't be watching for escaping slaves. Only a madman would try to escape into the wilds of the southern moors. No, they were much more occupied with listening to the howls of the approaching Gavadar. That was what Edmund had counted on. The slaves would assume, and rightly so, that it would be safer to stay by the fires. None would try to run. Yet, not until the laughing began. The howls still sounded, closer together. They were out of the firelight now. Slowly, they made their way down a hill into a small gully next to the camp. At the bottom, Willow and Edmund set their faces west and picked their way through the rocky gulch. It wasn't until they had walked for an hour that, as Willow and Edmund came to the top of a rocky heath mound, they thought it safe enough to stop and light the torches. Willow removed a small steel rod which hung from one of her antlers. Striking it against a piece of broken chert that she had grabbed from the gully, she was able to produce a small, weak spark. Edmund quickly gathered a little bundle of dry grass from around his feet and held it sheltered from the wind as Willow attempted to light it. Finally, after a few minutes of trying, the tinder bundle caught the spark, and with a few coaxing breaths from Edmund, it burned with a small flame. Willow chuckled. Edmund looked up at her, smiling at their success, but his smile disappeared when he saw her face, laced with concern, staring back at him. She hadn't laughed. They quickly lit the torches. Standing back to back at the top of a moor was not an ideal place to hide, but they had no choice now. With the torchlight illuminating their surroundings, they saw that they were trapped. Around them, just outside the torchlight, were 5 huge figures, like boulders in the darkness. One was circling them. At the shoulder, it stood as tall as Edmund's head, the size of a large bear. Its back sloped down into short hind legs that seemed too small for its large frame. Bristling hair ran down its muscle-bound spine to its short tail. Its jaw was square and bulky, bulging with muscle and teeth. Massive forepaws padded along the rocky turf, mere paces away. Edmund and Willow kept their torches out in front of them. Bone-chilling laughter rose from the Gavader, high-pitched and eerie. The one paced closer with each turn. Edmund desperately wished that he could get at his magic. The torch seemed so small in the face of the Gavader. Suddenly the beast turned eastward and stood still, listening. Heaving itself up onto its hind legs, the Gavader stretched its nose to the wind. Willow jerked her head eastward as well, testing the air with her nose. "They're coming," she whispered urgently to Edmund. "The Fjorkirs are chasing us. I thought you said they wouldn't risk it over 2 slaves." "They aren't using magic, are they?" asked Edmund. "We still stand a chance at escape if they aren't. We need to move now." The Gavader had sunk back onto all fours and moved out of the firelight. The others had disappeared out of sight as well, but Edmund knew that they were still there. The laughing continued. "Willow!" urged Edmund. "We have to go now!" Willow nodded at him, and they moved carefully westward. The Gavader fell in behind them and followed, laughing quietly. Willow led the way, and Edmund followed close to her side, keeping his torch pointed backward. Whenever he moved the torch to one side or the other, it would cast a light on the Gavader that had crept in closer than the rest, which would then quickly sink back into the darkness with the others. When this happened, Edmund would steer Willow into the other direction, trying to get further away. They walked on, the Gavader stalking them closer every minute, now fully in the light of the torches. They could occasionally see the torchlight of the slavers in the distance. As they rounded a bend, Willow stopped suddenly. Edmund stumbled into her. He heard her curse quietly. Looking around her, he saw a large Gavader sitting on its haunches directly in their path. It stood up as they arrived and began to laugh. Willow cursed again, louder this time. Edmund's heart sank as he realized what had happened. The hunting Gavader had herded them here. He looked around him at the terrain and saw rocky cliffs on either side. They were trapped. He began to panic. There was no escape. The Gavader in front of them had been joined by 2 others. Behind them, 4 blocked their way. The laughter grew louder, almost to a howling. Pawing at the rocks beneath their feet, they began to slowly close in. Willow and Edmund brandished their torches menacingly while shouting and throwing rocks in an attempt to keep them at bay, but the more they shouted, the louder the Gavader laughed. One of the larger ones charged at Willow, then backed quickly out of reach of her torch. Again, this time toward Edmund. Soon, all the surrounding Gavader had joined in and were dashing in close and back out again, in and out, snapping and laughing. They never barked or growled. The only sound they made was the uncanny laughing that sank deep into Edmund's mind, driving him mad with the desire to flee, to run like a scared deer out onto the moor. With each lunge, the Gavader came closer and closer, sometimes knocking the torches out of their way with a swipe from their bear-like paws. They now made no attempt at evading the torches, and Edmund found that he had to hit them with the flaming stick to keep them away. All the while, the laughing continued. Then, one of them lunged forward and seized Edmund's torch with its teeth. There was a brief struggle as he tried desperately to wrestle a piece of wood away from the beast, and though he resisted with all he had, the Gavader yanked the torch out of his grasp, and, with a swing of its head, tossed it away. They now had only Willow's torch, and Edmund pressed himself as close as possible to her back. His aching ribcage burned with pain from his fearful panting. A hulking face emerged from the darkness toward him, its teeth bared in a snarl as it crept slowly closer and closer. He seized a rock, ready to defend himself. The Gavader grew closer on each side. Willow shouted to Edmund, "We need to get our backs to the cliff face." Edmund shouted back his agreement. The 2 of them carefully maneuvered to Willow's left and backed themselves up to the rocks. The Gavader all moved into a semicircle around them, pressing them into the cliff. "River," said Willow fearfully. He looked over at her and saw that she held the torch up where he could see it. It was dying. Edmund panicked. Without the torch, they wouldn't last a minute. The laughter seemed to grow even louder. The torchlight grew smaller and smaller. Edmund and Willow looked at each other. The laughter of the Gavader rang in their ears as their only hope of survival sputtered and went out. Well, that wraps up this chapter. Stay tuned for the next chapter of the Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand coming soon. In the meantime, you can head over to Amazon and pick up your very own copy. The link is in the description. Leave a comment and a like, make sure to subscribe for more content, and until next time, enjoy the adventure.